It was a bustling Tuesday afternoon at Woodbridge National Bank. The lobby buzzed with activity, customers stood in snaking lines, murmuring impatiently as employees hustled to address a seemingly endless stream of queries. The faint whir of the air conditioner mingled with the clicking keyboards, creating a cacophony of modern bureaucracy. Among the crowd was an elderly woman, Grace Turner. She stood out, not for her appearance, but for the way she clutched an envelope, her hands trembling slightly, a mix of nervousness and determination etched on her face. Grace had come to address what seemed to be an inexplicable error in her bank account. To her, it wasn't just about money, it was about survival. Her fixed income left no room for unexpected charges, and each unexplained withdrawal gnawed away at the fragile stability of her life. She had spent days gathering her account statements, her efforts culminating in the neatly packed envelope she held close to her chest. But Grace's day was about to take a turn she never expected. It began with subtle dismissals that would escalate into public humiliation, and end with an intervention no one in the bank could have anticipated. The meeting with disdain. Grace approached the counter, her nerves betraying her. The teller, a young woman named Amanda, glanced up briefly, her face displaying the practiced indifference of someone who had seen one too many complaints that day. "Good afternoon," Grace began, her voice soft yet steady. "I need help with some charges on my account. I believe there's been a mistake." Amanda sighed, her fingers pausing briefly over her keyboard. "Do you have your account number and ID?" she asked, her tone clipped. Grace fumbled for her documents, offering them with a small smile, but Amanda took them with barely a glance. After a few minutes of clicking and scrolling, Amanda handed back the papers, her gaze still fixed on her screen. "These fees are standard, ma'am. They're in the terms and conditions you agreed to." Grace blinked, momentarily stunned. "But I don't understand, these charges started recently, and I've been with this bank for years. I've never had this issue before." Amanda's eyes met Grace's for the first time, her expression one of impatience. "Ma'am, if you don't maintain a certain balance, fees are applied automatically. That's just how it works." Grace felt the first pang of humiliation as Amanda's voice rose slightly, drawing glances from nearby customers. She took a deep breath. "I've always been careful with my account. I just need someone to explain why this is happening now." Amanda's lips curved into a slight smirk as she leaned back in her chair. "It's all in the contract, ma'am. Maybe you should have read it more carefully." Grace's heart sank. She wanted to speak up, to argue, but the weight of the stairs around her made her voice falter. Just as she opened her mouth to try again, a man in a sharp suit approached the counter. His name was Robert Hayes, the branch manager, and his air of authority was unmistakable. The manager steps in. "Is there a problem here?" Robert asked, his tone brisk as his eyes flicked between Grace and Amanda. Amanda straightened immediately, her demeanor shifting into one of false efficiency. "No problem, sir. The customer is just confused about standard account fees." Grace tried to explain, her words spilling out in a rush. "It's not confusion. These charges, they weren't there before. I think." Robert raised a hand to silence her, his smile thin and patronizing. "Ma'am, I'm sure our staff has already explained this, but these fees are clearly outlined in our terms. If you're having trouble maintaining the balance, I'd recommend exploring other options, perhaps a different type of account." The implication was clear. If Grace couldn't afford the fees, perhaps she didn't belong at this bank. Her cheeks flushed as the murmurs around her grew louder. She clutched her envelope tighter, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Before she could respond, a voice cut through the tension. "Why are you speaking to her like that? An unexpected savior." The room fell silent. Heads turned toward the source of the voice, a man in jeans and a simple leather jacket, standing near the entrance. His dark hair was slightly tousled, and there was a calm intensity in his gaze. As he stepped forward, recognition began to ripple through the crowd. It was Keanu Reeves. The realization swept through the room like a wave. Customers whispered in disbelief, their phones discreetly rising to capture the unfolding scene. Keanu's presence was magnetic, commanding attention without effort. But his focus was unwavering as he approached Grace and Robert. "What's going on here?" Keanu asked, his tone firm yet measured. Robert, clearly flustered, straightened his tie. "Mr. Reeves, this is a private matter." "The customer is." Keanu raised a hand, mirroring Robert's earlier gesture. "I heard what you said. This isn't just a misunderstanding, it's about respect. And from where I'm standing, it seems like she's not getting any." Grace stared at Keanu, her eyes wide with disbelief. For the first time in what felt like hours, the humiliation and despair began to ebb, replaced by a flicker of hope. Keanu's words hung in the air, silencing the whispers and halting the movements of customers and staff alike. Robert shifted uncomfortably under the weight of the actor's piercing gaze, his usual air of authority crumbling. Grace stood frozen, her heart pounding as she realized the world-famous actor was standing up for her. "Mr. Reeves," Robert began, his voice tight, "while I appreciate your concern, this is a private financial matter. It would be best." Keanu cut him off with a calm yet firm tone. "Respect isn't a private matter. You're running a business, and that means treating every customer with dignity, no matter the size of their account." He turned to Grace, offering a reassuring smile. "Ma'am, would you mind showing me what's in your envelope? Maybe I can help." Grace hesitated, but the kindness in his expression gave her the courage to nod. She handed him the envelope, her hands still trembling slightly. Keanu opened it and began reviewing the documents inside, his brow furrowing in concentration. The crowd watched in hushed anticipation, phones still recording every moment. "This doesn't add up," Keanu said after a moment, looking up at Robert. "These charges started appearing 2 months ago, but there's no clear explanation. You're telling me this is just an automatic fee?" Robert's face reddened, his composure slipping further. "As I said, Mr. Reeves, these fees are outlined in our policies. If the customer had maintained the minimum balance." Keanu interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "So you're saying it's her fault for not being wealthy enough to avoid your fees?" He gestured toward the crowd. "How many of you have experienced something like this? Unexplained charges, dismissive treatment. Raise your hands." To Robert's dismay, several hands went up. The murmurs grew louder, frustration bubbling to the surface as other customers began to share their grievances. "This happened to me last year," one man called out. "They charged me hundreds in overdraft fees for a mistake they made." "Me too," a woman chimed in. "They never even apologized." Keanu nodded, his expression firm. "It's not just her, is it? This is a pattern, a system designed to take advantage of people who are just trying to get by." The unraveling. Robert's eyes darted nervously around the room as the atmosphere shifted. Even the employees behind the counters began exchanging uneasy glances. Amanda, who had initially dismissed Grace, now looked visibly uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact with Keanu and the crowd. "Enough," Robert snapped, attempting to regain control. "This is getting out of hand. Mr. Reeves, I must insist you leave." "No," Keanu said, his voice sharp but calm. "What's getting out of hand is the way this bank is treating its customers. And we're not going anywhere until we get some answers." At that moment, one of the tellers, a young man named Jason, hesitantly stepped forward. "Mr. Hayes," he said, addressing Robert, "maybe we should take another look at her account. There might actually be a mistake." Robert glared at Jason, but before he could respond, Keanu interjected. "That's the first sensible thing I've heard all day. Let's review it. Right here, right now." The crowd murmured in agreement, the collective pressure mounting on Robert. Reluctantly, he motioned for Jason to proceed. The young teller returned to his station, pulling up Grace's account on his computer. As he typed, Keanu stood beside him, his presence both reassuring and commanding. After a few tense moments, Jason's eyes widened. "Sir," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "there's a problem. These charges, they were applied manually. They weren't automatic fees." The room fell silent. Robert's face paled as the implications of Jason's discovery set in. "What does that mean?" Keanu asked, his tone measured but intense. Jason hesitated before continuing. "It means someone at the bank added these charges manually. It wasn't a system error, it was deliberate. The plot thickens." Gasps rippled through the crowd as the revelation sank in. Grace covered her mouth with her hands, tears welling in her eyes. "You mean, someone did this on purpose?" she whispered. Keanu's jaw tightened. He turned to Robert, his expression a mix of disbelief and controlled anger. "Care to explain this?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Robert stammered, his composure crumbling. I don't know anything about this. There must be some mistake." Keanu raised a hand, silencing him. "The only mistake here is underestimating how much people will tolerate before they fight back. Now, who's responsible for this?" Jason looked nervously at Robert before continuing. "It appears these charges were applied to multiple accounts, not just Mrs. Turner's. And," he paused, swallowing hard. "Most of them belong to elderly customers." The outrage in the room reached a boiling point. Customers began shouting, demanding answers, while Robert tried in vain to quiet them. Keanu, however, remained calm, his focus laser-sharp. "This isn't just a mistake," he said, his voice carrying over the commotion. "This is a scheme. And we're not leaving until we figure out exactly who's behind it." The crowd erupted into cheers, their faith in Keanu growing with every passing moment. Grace, standing beside him, felt a renewed sense of strength. For the first time in a long time, she believed justice might finally be within reach. The bank lobby was electric with tension. Customers buzzed with frustration, their voices rising as accusations and demands for accountability filled the air. Keanu Reeves stood firm, his calm presence contrasting the chaos around him. Grace Turner, standing beside him, felt overwhelmed but supported, a sense of hope she hadn't experienced in years beginning to grow within her. Jason, the young teller, continued typing at his terminal, uncovering more unsettling details. His face grew pale as he examined the data. "Mr. Hayes," Jason stammered, addressing Robert, "this goes deeper than just a few accounts. There are hundreds of customers affected." The crowd gasped, their anger deepening. A man at the back shouted, "What are you going to do about it?" Another customer chimed in, "We want our money back." Keanu turned to Robert, his piercing gaze unwavering. "This is your chance to come clean," he said, his tone low and controlled. "Who authorized these charges?" Robert's composure was gone, replaced by a sheen of sweat on his forehead. He fumbled for words, his voice breaking. I don't know. I'll need to investigate." "No," Keanu interrupted sharply. "You don't need more time to investigate. The evidence is right there, and these people deserve answers now." Robert opened his mouth to protest, but the growing anger of the crowd silenced him. He looked around desperately, hoping for support, but even his own employees had begun to distance themselves from him, their faces a mixture of fear and guilt. A hidden ally. Just then, a voice from the side broke through the noise. "I know what happened." All heads turned toward the speaker, an older woman in a professional suit. Her name badge identified her as Ellen Fitzgerald, the assistant branch manager. She stepped forward, her expression somber but resolute. "Ellen," Robert said, his voice tinged with both relief and panic. "What are you doing?" Ellen ignored him, addressing the crowd instead. "I've been with this bank for over 20 years, she began, her voice steady. "And I've seen a lot of things I'm not proud of. But this," she gestured toward the screen displaying the fraudulent charges. This was deliberate. It was done to exploit our most vulnerable customers, the elderly and those living paycheck to paycheck. The crowd murmured in shock, their anger turning into a mixture of disbelief and sorrow. Who ordered it? Keanu asked, his voice cutting through the murmurs. Ellen hesitated before responding. It came from higher up, the regional office. But Robert, she said, turning to the branch manager, you knew. You approved it. You told us to prioritize profits over people. The room erupted in outrage, the crowd's fury now squarely directed at Robert. He stepped back, his face pale, as customers shouted accusations and demands for his resignation. Accountability in action. Keanu raised his hands, signaling for calm. The room quieted, though the tension remained palpable. He turned to Robert, his voice firm but measured. You have two choices. You can admit what you've done and take responsibility, or you can wait for the authorities to come and deal with it. Robert's jaw tightened as he realized he was cornered. With nowhere to turn, he finally muttered, fine. We'll fix this. I'll call the regional office and... No, Keanu interrupted. You'll start by fixing Mrs. Turner's account. Right now. Jason, emboldened by Keanu's presence, stepped forward. I can do it, he said, sitting back at his terminal. Mrs. Turner, if you'll give me just a moment, I'll reverse the charges and make sure your account is fully restored. Grace nodded, tears streaming down her face. Thank you, she whispered, her voice trembling. As Jason worked, Keanu turned back to the crowd. To everyone here, I promise you this story isn't over. What happened today is going to come to light. We'll make sure every one of you gets justice. The crowd erupted in applause, their faith in Keanu bolstered by his unwavering commitment. A viral moment of change. By the time Grace's account was restored, the bank was in full damage control mode. Ellen had already begun printing records to share with the authorities, and several customers were preparing to file formal complaints. Robert, meanwhile, slunk into his office, his career effectively over. As Grace turned to Keanu, her eyes filled with gratitude. I don't know how to thank you, she said, her voice shaking. I felt so small, so powerless. But you gave me my voice back. Keanu smiled warmly. You never lost your voice, Grace. You just needed someone to listen. And now, your story will inspire others to stand up for what's right. The videos of Keanu's intervention quickly went viral, sparking a nationwide conversation about corporate accountability in customer rights. News outlets picked up the story, and public pressure forced the bank's leadership to issue an apology and commit to a full audit of their practices. Robert and others involved in the scheme faced legal consequences, while Ellen and Jason were hailed as whistleblowers and advocates for change. A renewed hope. Days later, Grace received a letter from the bank's headquarters. Inside was not only a full reimbursement of the charges but also an apology and additional compensation for the distress caused. She smiled through her tears as she read the letter, feeling a sense of justice she hadn't thought possible. Meanwhile, Keanu Reeves continued with his life, refusing to comment publicly on the incident. For him, it wasn't about the recognition, it was about doing the right thing. But his actions left a lasting impression, inspiring countless others to stand up for fairness and compassion. As Grace walked through her neighborhood one sunny afternoon, she noticed her neighbors waving to her, their faces alight with pride and admiration. She held her head high, her renewed confidence a testament to the power of kindness and courage. And somewhere in Hollywood, Keanu Reeves smiled, knowing that one ordinary afternoon in a bank had turned into a moment of extraordinary change.